Hello, I'm Christian, this is my friend Chris, and my friend Jeremy. You might recognize them from other videos. How are you, Chris? It's been a while since I've seen you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I really wanted him for this particular review. I was willing to even go to his job if he was working tonight just to do this review, but we're doing a book review, and the book we want to review is It by Stephen King. This is my copy of It, which is all worn to shit, and there's Jeremy's copy. Now, before we really get on to this review, I do have to address sort of an elephant in the room. This is actually the third review on this book that I've done on this channel. I first reviewed the book back in 2011, but then a few years later I was like, that review sucked, so I redid the review in 2015, and my 2015 review on the book was actually one of my most viewed videos on YouTube. But it's a book that I really wanted to read again, and really wanted to explore again in a video, so what I decided to do is my 2015 review on the book is still up, however it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but you could still see it with a link, and I'll leave a link to my 2015 review on Stephen King's It in the description below. Now, it was published in 1986, and this is my personal favorite Stephen King novel, and it's also one of my top 5 favorite books of all time. But before I really fangasm over this book, what do you guys think of It?
Well, man, I think it's bold to say it's your favorite out of all of them. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, I love it. I think that quotation that it's the Moby Dick of horror, I think it's pretty applicable, but it's tough to say if it's my favorite, because I read a lot of Stephen King, and I've loved a lot of Stephen King. But I think I do consider it to be like perfect encapsulation of what a horror novel is.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I heard that at the time he wrote this. I could be wrong on this, but I think he actually wanted to try to move away from horror, so he kind of wanted this to be his final word on the horror genre. And which makes sense, because the book does play around with a couple of different horror tropes, and the villain, in a lot of ways, is almost a representation of every horror villain and every horror monster you could think of.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, honestly, it's partially the length, the characters, kind of what the monster means to them, what they mean to the monster. I think it's that kind of interplay that really defines it.
Yeah, but I also think calling it just a horror story is kind of missing the point. To me, this is so much more than just a horror novel. It's also a deeply moving coming-of-age story. It's a drama, it's a dark fantasy novel, it's kind of a science fiction novel as well. But there's also a lot of deeper themes in this about childhood trauma, childhood abuse, and the bad habits that adults force on children. There's even some political and social issues in this, like racism, homophobia, and sexism. Jeremy, what do you think of this?
I love it. It's always been one of my favorite Stephen King novels. In fact, it actually, just like you, it might be my favorite out of all of them, because, you know, it is so terrifying, and yet there's a lot of sweet, sentimental parts of it, too, that always just, tugged at my heartstrings. It's definitely about, growing up and, facing your fears and just dealing with trauma. And there's just so much in there that really just, like I said, it's just very moving and terrifying. I mean, There's just so much in this book that keeps me up at night.
Now, this is also sort of Stephen King's take on the story, The Three Billy Goats Gruff, which you could definitely see that. Like, it is almost like a representation of the Troll, and the Losers Club are almost a representation of the Billy Goats. And the book is also, in a lot of ways, I don't know if you would agree with this, but it really does almost feel like a contemporary fairy tale in some sense.
For sure. Especially with like the mirages that Pennywise takes on and all that. Yeah, it's like sort of these modern monsters right out of fairy tales. I could totally see that, yeah.
Now, the plot of It is it's about a group of 7 adults who, when they were children, all lived in a small town in Maine called Derry. But 6 of the 7 have long since moved away from the town and have grown up to become very successful. But one night, Mike Hanlon, the one who stayed behind, calls up his 6 childhood friends to get them to come back to Derry to make good on a promise they made in the summer of 1958 when they were all kids. Exactly what that promise was, you come to learn throughout the course of the story. Now, when these characters were children, they were all friends with each other, but they didn't have too many friends outside of their initial group. They were all, for one reason or another, social outcasts, so they were dubbed the Losers Club. Now, in 1958, there was a series of murders and disappearances happening in Derry, mostly involving young children, and the Losers Club discovered that these murders were not being committed by a person, but by something much worse. It turns out that the town of Derry is haunted by an evil entity, and at first it appears that this entity has been haunting this town for hundreds of years, but you soon learn that this thing's been around long before the town was even built. Now, this entity primarily targets children, and it can manifest itself into the form of whatever a child is most afraid of. For example, if a child is afraid of the Frankenstein monster, it will take on the form of the Frankenstein monster. If a child is afraid of the creature from the Black Lagoon or the mummy, it will take on the form of those things. It can also manifest itself as a vampire or a werewolf or a zombie. It can even take on human form if it wanted to, but it generally takes on the form of a clown, and when it takes on the form of a clown, it calls itself Bob Gray, or Pennywise the Clown. Now, in 1958, the Losers Club discovered a way to fight back against it, and they actually defeated the demon. So now it's 27 years later, the year is 1985, and it appears that it has returned. So Mike tries to get his 6 friends to come back to the town and once again do battle with this creature. The question becomes, can they fight it as adults? Now, this is a slight spoiler, but it turns out that these characters are being guided by some kind of a higher power, and it turns out that their battle with it is tied into a larger cosmic battle that spans billions of years and could potentially be tied in with the very creation of our universe. But the book is, in essence, kind of 2 stories in one, because it's constantly jumping back and forth between 1985 and 1958. What do you guys think of the characters in it? And real quick for the audience, I do want to warn you all that there probably will be spoilers in this video. I mean, it's unavoidable when you have 3 people talking about this book. But what do you guys think of the characters in it? Specifically, the Losers Club.
Oh, I think they're great characters. You know, as you mentioned before, they're all outcasts, which brings them together. And, you know, they all have their, you know, flaws, and they all have their strengths and their weaknesses. But they all, I think, have this loving bond that is just so beautiful to watch and...
Or read about, really.
Yeah, read about. Well, for the films, watch. But, and, you know, they also all have their own distinct personalities. You know, Bill is the leader, Eddie is the hypochondriac, Richie is the jokester, you know, Ben is the hopeless romantic lover, you could say. You know, I'm just saying they all have their distinct personalities that are very entertaining. And, you know, like I said, they all have their flaws. You know, for example, Richie, I mean, I know he's a jokester, but there were times I found him kind of annoying. Like,
I loved Richie personally in the book. In the movies, which we'll talk about the adaptations later on, but in the movies I can see that. In the book, not so much. Like, he had some really funny moments, especially the adult parts where, like, there's a scene where he sees it as an adult, and, like, just some of the things he says to it, which you could tell is him masking his terror with humor, but, like, some of them are really hilarious. But Richie is a great character.
Yeah, I mean, I don't hate him, and he's not always annoying. He does have some great moments. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'm just saying sometimes I think, like, he kind of jokingly insults his friends at times, and I think, come on, dude, don't you think you're pushing it a little, you know?
But he does making racial jokes in front of Mike. That's right.
Yeah. He also makes fun of Ben's weight.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Richie's irritability is kind of intended. You know. Because most of the jokesters in any kind of social circle get irritating after a while.
Yes.
Yeah. And then they have that thing where if they want him to shut the fuck up, they say beep beep Richie.
Richie.
No, I mean, yeah, but at the end of the day, he has a good heart, just like they all do.
Right.
And, I also want to mention Stan, who, he's kind of the one who wants everything to be sort of perfect and real, and, he's the one who is kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? He just doesn't want to believe.
Yeah, actually, a part of the book that I really liked is when it talks about his first encounter with it, when it took on the form of those dead little boys who drowned. He said that the worst part of it was it offended him, because it offended his sensibilities, it offended his view on the world.
Yeah, and another interesting part was when they're all in the Barrens and they're all discussing how they've seen it. And, they want Stan to open up and tell them, and he's very resistant. He is to the point where he gets angry and he tells Richie to shut up!
Yeah.
He starts to cry, and, then he's about to share, but then that obnoxious Irish cop interrupts.
I love them all so much. I think what Stephen always gets right, I think, first and foremost, is characters.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very vital part of storytelling. Because you want to empathize with these people and care about them, and that's important in horror in particular, because if you care about these people, you're going to feel even worse when what they go through happens.
Yes.
I think Bev, honestly, is my favorite out of all of them, because
Bev is actually a very complex character, I would say.
Exactly. Yeah. I was so struck by kind of the depiction of somebody who's like, she's such a great, sweet person that people just keep treating terribly. It's very sad, very kind of like tragic life story for her. Mm-hmm. And then second would be Richie, just because he's just such a jokester. But I love that everybody has like their different roles. Yeah. Like Bill being the leader, and Stan kind of being the outsider, even though within his own circle of friends he's still the outsider.
And then Mike is kind of literally the bookkeeper in a lot of ways.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I really like Mike. Mike might actually be my favorite of the characters. And he's also the character where some of the racial themes of it come in, which I do want to talk about that in a little bit, like some of the deeper themes of the novel. But I would say Mike and Bill, to me, always came off as the most important members of the Losers Club. Yeah.
It's hard for me to pick a favorite, because I just love them all. But, I'm not saying this definitively, but I will say maybe Bill and Ben are my favorites. Bill because, he's the leader who kind of gathers them all together. He's also the one who has the most personal vendetta against it.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to bring up, is how, in the novel, Bill's younger brother, Georgie, is killed by it. He's actually the first character you even meet in the book is Georgie, and so you could tell Bill has like a personal vendetta against it. But there's also a lot of really sad moments in the book where you could tell Bill does feel some guilt over Georgie's death, and there are really heartbreaking passages in the book about how his parents have kind of just distanced themselves from Bill, or it almost seems from Bill's point of view that they're blaming him for Georgie, and I thought that was that was just so sad. Like, it actually reminded me of The Body with Gordy LaChance, with his brother who ended up getting killed. Like, it almost reminded me of that in a lot of ways. Yeah, and, the distance between Gordy and his father.
I also like Ben because, he struggles with his weight, and, he's constantly picked on by everyone for it. And, he's also, he's in love with Beverly, but I don't know if this is stated in the novel, I don't remember, but he probably thinks, the fat kid can't get the girl. So, that also makes him more sympathetic.
And then that beautiful little poem he writes to her.
Yeah. The Lyco poem,
yeah. And I just love how he's so protective of her that I remember one part in the book was like, I think it's their first, as a group, encounter with it at the house at Neibolt Street. It's in its werewolf form. Mm-hmm. And I think Ben says something like, if it hurts her, I'll kill it.
Yeah. When he first meets her, they go to see the movie, and then after they come out, they encounter Henry Bowers and some of the other bullies, and, when one of them starts picking on her, that's where he really, attacks them and, pretty much overpowers them, too.
We've talked a lot about the Losers Club characters as kids, but what about them as adults? As adults, they kind of... they don't change too much other than the memories. Their personalities, I think, are still intact, but I can't help but feel that it is different when you're reading them as adults.
That's why I said in my plot description, this is almost two stories in one. Like, they're both stories deal with the same sets of characters, but I almost feel both stories are so different in a lot of ways, even though they're both told simultaneously with each other. But I think this book really does a beautiful job at showing you the differences between childhood and adulthood. Now, there are two human villains in the story. One is Henry Bowers, who, when they were kids, was one of the bullies who would constantly pick on them. Now, at first glance, you think Henry Bowers is just your typical bully, but as you read more into the character, you realize just how psychotic he actually is. And I think Henry Bowers is one of Stephen King's greatest villains, I would say. And the thing I like about Bowers is, like, I don't think he's an unsympathetic character because he is the victim of child abuse. Like, in a lot of ways, he is exactly what his father made him, which definitely ties into the novel's themes of child abuse. But what do you think of Henry Bowers as a villain?
I think the number one thing that makes a villain is kind of their backstory. Whatever kind of motivation they have, and in Henry's case, yeah, it's a fucked up childhood and kind of having the weight of a lot of anxiety over you, to the point where you overcompensate and you kind of try too hard and you become a bully and all this stuff. It's because it's true to life. You know, most bullies are having a really tough time at home.
What do you think of Henry Bowers?
Oh, he's terrifying.
Yeah,
and he's just so mean and sadistic. And he just does not give a single flying fuck about anyone he hurts or however much pain he causes. I mean, he's a true sadist.
Yeah. When he kills Mike Hanlon's dog.
Yeah, when he cuts the H into Ben's stomach. It's like, he enjoys it, and you can tell he enjoys it. I mean, he's a wacko.
Yeah. And then the other human villain of the story is the character of Tom Rogan, who is Beverly's husband, obviously, when Beverly is an adult. And Tom Rogan, not only is he a misogynistic prick, but he's also extremely abusive towards Beverly. And, again, this is a minor spoiler, but when Beverly is called by Mike and she returns to Derry, he ends up following her. What do you think of Tom Rogan as a villain?
I think it's, particularly terrifying because, you know, a lot of people have dealt with domestic abuse and all that. I'm sure kind of reading some of this hit hard for them. I think Rose Madder is another one that dealt with domestic abuse pretty forwardly. And one of my favorite passages, not in a sadistic way, just in a way that it follows Tom and Beverly's relationship. And very gradually it turns into an abusive one. And maybe it's not authentic, but it feels very true to how that kind of thing starts to break down after a while. You know, it's terrifying because it's real. You know, it's part of real life.
Not only because he tries to prevent Bev from leaving to go help the other losers, and I mean, he's so manipulative of her, you know, and of her business. You know, and he's also really jealous, even though I always got the feeling that if he got the chance, he would cheat on her at a moment's notice.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
You know, and I distinctly remember the part where Bev fights back, and he just goes, "Oh, bitch, you broke my mouth!"
Scene in the book, too, when she finally stands up to him.
Her defiance is great, and then the whole thing where she just runs into the night laughing, and I was, you know, even reading it, I was like, yeah, go Bev, like, good shit.
Yeah. And speaking of villains, there is one character who I don't want to say is a villain per se, because he has such a small part in the story, but there is a character named Patrick Hockstetter, who's a complete psychopath, who plays a very specific role in one particular chapter of the book. Even though he's not one of the main villains, what do you think of this character?
Oh man, he's a real bastard. I mean, what he does to those poor animals is just horrendous. He's probably an even bigger sadist than Henry Bowers is.
Yeah, because with Patrick, it's like Henry was at least like, you know, you realize he was what his father made him. Patrick doesn't really have a reason. He was just kind of born without empathy.
Really, his parents, from what little is described of his backstory, his parents seem perfectly fine.
Yeah.
And it's also implied that, you know, he killed his younger brother.
I don't even think it's implied. I think it's said flat out that he smothered his younger brother.
But, and his death is probably one of the most deserved deaths in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's so perfect, too. And I was always really disappointed that they never adapted that well, but we'll get into that later.
I mean, I don't think he's on the same level as Henry or anything like that, but like you said, him actually having like committed a murder in the past is a whole other level of fucked up.
Like, he's a character who almost feels like he should have been the villain of another story, almost. Like, he almost should have been his own story.
Which is what Steven does well. You get like all these like little subplots that feel like they're their own thing, but you know, it's great how they all sort of interlock, you know. He's really good at coming up with sort of like town history, that kind of thing, like relationships between people and like, you know, people who've known each other for 20 years, you know. That like hometown appeal, I think, is what plays so well into the villains of the story in particular.
Now, Jeremy did want to bring up more about Patrick's death scene, which this is a spoiler again if you haven't read the book, but go on, what do you want to talk about with the death scene?
It's one of the best death scenes in the entire book. I mean, never have I felt... Well, actually, I felt it, but this character just deserved this so much. I mean, it was just so satisfying and just so... I mean, I found myself sometimes reading it over and over and over again.
Wow, what did this kid do to you?
But I mean, it's a great death scene, you know, and he does truly get what he deserves. He jerks Henry off. And Henry is so embarrassed that he actually threatens to do something good for once, which is report Patrick to the police for all the, you know, dead animals in that fridge he keeps in the junkyard. And, I mean, it's literally a fridge just full of dead animals that they're people's pets. He kidnapped them and killed them. Or I think he kept some of them alive for a little while just so they could slowly, you know, freeze to death and that he could torture them more. It's horrible. And so after Henry leaves, you know, he says, oh shit, he's going to tell the police. I have to go get rid of all this evidence. And he goes to do it, but when he opens the fridge, it's not the dead animals he finds. It's a bunch of flying leeches. Big, ugly, you know, black leeches. And these boys sure do love to suck, because they all latch onto him, they grab a mouthful of his fucking skin, and they just, I mean, they go to town on him.
It sounds like if Patrick were a real person, you probably would have, like, punched him in the face if you saw him.
Yes, oh yes, I would have. And he tries to pull them off, but it just, you know, more just keep coming, and, you know...
It's a nightmarish death scene, too.
And, you know, I love the description of how once they latch on and they start sucking his blood, they get bigger and they get fatter, and it's just, it puts an image in my head of these writhing little black masses. And they've probably got their teeth and their, you know, round hole of a mouth. And they're sucking and sucking and sucking. And it's just, they're draining them dry.
I mean, there's a great kind of, I think, resolution that comes with death scenes that are kind of retribution, you know? Like, I know there's lots of horror movies like that where you're just watching terrible people get what they deserve, you know?
Yeah.
Yes.
You see that in Steven stuff a lot, you know?
Yeah.
So
I love how Patrick is sort of a minor villain in the story, yet we talked about him more than the other two human villains in the story.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll come up again at some point.
Yeah. Now, one of the major themes of the novel is definitely childhood abuse and childhood trauma, but also very much the cycles of abuse, and you especially see that with the Beverly Marsh character, where as a child she's abused by her father, and it's never said flat out, but it is hinted that there might be sexual abuse as well, and then as an adult, she's married to a very abusive husband. In the book, you kind of see how different people respond to abuse, like you see Beverly, who becomes very submissive as an adult because of her abuse, whereas Henry Bowers becomes an abuser because of the abuse he takes from his father. But what do you guys think of the themes of abuse in this novel?
I think they probably ring really true to home, because I feel like people who go through cycles of abuse, they get to a place where they accidentally end up kind of encouraging it, because they don't have a bar for what should be allowed and what shouldn't.
Yeah, and you see that with Beverly too.
Yeah, it's a shame to see people go through, unfortunately, but it is very true. And,
but it's also great to see Beverly actually overcome that eventually in the novel.
I've seen it so much when she finally, it's just like, you know, tells him to go fuck himself. And it's such a great play on what the novel is, like the contrast between what you put up with as a kid, what you put up with as an adult. Some of it's the same, some of it's different. And and also kind of using that to kind of do the horror thing, which is like, here's what we're normally afraid of, and here's the real life problems that we deal with every day that we should be afraid of and we should deal with, you know. And those monsters in the dark is really just an extrapolation of those real fears, you know. It's sort of just like a caricature almost, you know.
Those themes are very prevalent, you know, especially as you said with Beverly and Henry, and you know, I think to a lesser extent even Bill, because you know, he mentions how after Georgie's death, his parents, you know, they hardly act like he's even there. I mean,
and even sorry to cut you off, but even with Eddie, you could say what his mother puts him through is kind of abuse as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Bill's parental abuse isn't as bad as Beverly's or Eddie's, but I think that's still pretty abusive to like kind of shun your kid and also blame him wrongly for his brother's death.
And then even with the Tom Rogan character, it does talk about how he was abused by his mother. So again, it's that idea that some people, when they're abused, like they become very submissive because of that abuse, but then other people become abusers themselves. It's like abuse is this horrible, never-ending cycle, which you could even relate to the cycles of It in the novel.
Yeah. Hell, you can almost say that It is kind of abusing the whole town by feeding on it. You know, as it refers to them, it's its game preserve or something like that. And yeah, it's its hunting ground, and you know, it doesn't mind, you know, terrifying them and mutilating them and killing them. So yeah, you could say that's pretty abusive.
Yeah. Another major theme in the novel is definitely the power of friendship, which might sound kind of cheesy or melodramatic when I say that, but that is actually one of the themes of the book. Like, really, that's why I said this is so much more than just a horror novel, because this to me is one of the most human horror stories I've ever read, because it is ultimately a story about friendship.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think, obviously to say it out loud is cheesy, but I mean, you see it all throughout Stephen's work. You know, Dark Tower was all about like, you know, coming together and using each other's like individual attributes to, you know, become a collective whole. And I think it's an important thing in life, you know, because it's there are shut-ins, there are people who are self-sufficient, but I think you do need people, and I think people teach you things, and you know, you learn a lot. They give you insight that you might not have had before, you know. So I think it's an important theme to see in storytelling. I think it's great in this novel because they take out, like, you know, an ancient demon, you know, which is not an easy thing to do, and the reason most people die facing it is because they're alone. So it's important, you know. It's important to know that, you know, you need people in your life.
Yeah, another theme you definitely see in this, and this is something Stephen King very much explored in The Stand, is this idea that you have to make a stand against evil, which these kids definitely do.
The Losers Club, they're all very protective of each other, and you know, they all love each other, and that's definitely evident with Ben and Beverly. Ben just has this overwhelming desire to protect her at any cost, which really reinforces that theme. And you know, Bill must have thought of his brother as a friend of his because he has a desire to avenge him after his death.
Now, another major theme in this novel is definitely racism. Like, in the parts of this book that take place in the 1950s, you get a real sense of the racial tensions that were going on in the 1950s, and when Mike was a child, his family was really the only black family in Derry, so you definitely get a sense of the themes of racial discrimination with the character of Mike. A part of this book that's about the fire at the Black Spot, which that chapter, which technically it's not really a chapter, it's like a diary that Mike Hanlon is keeping, and it's something that his father experienced. Like, the fire at the Black Spot scene, that really could have almost been its own story, I think. Basically in the book, you find out in the 1930s there was this African-American hangout called the Black Spot, and a group of white supremacists set the place on fire, and you kind of get the implication that it was kind of manipulating those events. But what do you think of that scene in the book?
I think it's fantastic, especially since, you know, you're talking about contrasting what, you know, real life horror is with kind of fantastical horror. You know, hate crimes are fucked up.
Yeah,
it's like the worst thing one of the worst things a human being can do. And the idea of like all this racially motivated violence that's like still going on and still prevalent today is, you know, disgusting. But just as a fan of the book, I think I appreciate it for, trying to be hard-hitting about what happens, in the real world. Especially since this is a story about growing up and realizing how bad the world can be at times.
Yeah.
I guess just on a nerd level, I appreciate the Dick Halloran appearance. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, we'll save that for when we talk about the connections with this and King's other books. But yeah, that chapter is like, again, it almost could have been its own story, which is why I really feel like if to adapt this story properly, it would have to be a TV series or something, because you could do a whole episode on the fire at the Black Spot. And I like how Mike's father is kind of the main character of that particular chapter. What do you think of that?
Oh, it is absolutely horrific. I mean, first of all, it's horrific already just because, of these white supremacists doing this terrible thing, but also the descriptions that you read while you're reading it. He describes people's skin being burned off and melting, and people being roasted to cinders, burned alive, and how they're trying to scratch at the door, but they're all piled against it, so they can't get it open. And how they're trying to claw their way out, but there's no way out. Except the window, which Mike's father and Dick Halloran managed to crawl out of. But because you really feel people's desperation when you read that, and how terrifying it must have been.
But you also really get a sense of just how inhuman people can be to each other.
Yes.
Another major theme in the book is also homophobia. You especially see that with the second chapter, where in 1984, going into 1985, when the next cycle of murders happens, you see this gay couple get jumped by this gang of thugs, and the thugs brutally beat them and dump one of them over the bridge. And again, it's this idea that you're not sure how much of that it is manipulating, or maybe the reason it even comes back is because it is almost attracted to the hatred.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's just such a fucked up concept to start out with, and then comes that little creepy afterthought that, oh yeah, and we swore that we saw a clown attack him at the base of the bridge.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, and you're talking about this now, this very scary, like, supernatural shit.
Yeah, it's kind of this idea that... An idea I really got from the book is the same way that it feeds on the fears of the children in Derry, it also feeds off of and feeds into the hatred and the prejudices of the adults in Derry. Yeah. So you almost get this idea, like, you're not sure if, like, the reason there's so much, like, hatred and bigotry in Derry is because of it, or maybe the reason it is so powerful is because of the hatred and bigotry. Or maybe it's both. Like, maybe it's, like, this never-ending cycle.
Yeah, that scene is very brutal, and it's a hard scene to read because these poor guys did nothing wrong, and unfortunately they're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think one of the reasons that these bullies attack them, number one, it's because they're homophobic, but also because I remember one of them said, "Hey, why are you wearing that hat? The hat that's the side left area." It's almost like they're saying, the F word, aren't good enough to be wearing a hat that respects our town like that, take it off.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're trying to say, you don't belong here because of what you are.
At one point, the boyfriend, the one who survives that, he says, I don't remember if it was him or somebody else who says, when they're describing the clown, it was Derry.
Yeah.
Like, I like this idea that, in a sense, the town itself is almost a manifestation of it.
Yeah.
Like, the town is just as much a part of it as, like, the clown or the spider or anything like that.
It was Don Haggerty who said that, by the way.
Okay, yeah.
And, speaking of it, I just love how this scene, I think, really shows off its sadistic side, because, you've got Don Haggerty screaming for help because his boyfriend is being gruesomely murdered, and it just, like, mocks him by saying, "Help, help. Why ask for help when you can ask for a balloon? Here, have a balloon." And it just, it's enjoying it.
Yeah.
It's absolutely enjoying it.
Yeah, and I definitely think there are some deeper themes in the book, like, in a lot of ways, I kind of view Derry as almost being a metaphor for America itself, and it is almost a representation of the ugliness of human society, like particularly American society, especially in the 50s, but you kind of see the contrast between 1980s America and 1950s America. I don't know if you would agree with that interpretation or not.
No, I totally agree with it, yeah, that makes sense.
And I also just want to talk about the interrogation part of that that's intertwined with that scene, you know, where the cops are interviewing both Haggerty and the bullies. And I just love how Haggerty just kind of breaks down and said, you know, when one of them asks, you know, what did you do then? He just says, I ran, you dumb shit! You know, that just, I think, shows how traumatic it was. And also, the cops, or at least one of the cops, the older, gruffer one, I mean, he was kind of a dick, wasn't he? He was like, you know, saying, oh, he was out, you know, saying stuff like that. And,
well, that was also kind of the point. I think on one level, like, you kind of get the reason why there's so much, why the police department is so incompetent and so uncaring is because of it. Like, it's almost a subtle mind control sort of thing. Yeah. But it's also them as well, like...
Yeah, he's the cop who I just mentioned is the one who says, you know, keep quiet about this clown, you know. And, although I do like that he does still hate the bullies for what he did, because he says, you know, I hope that when they go to jail they get shanked, and I hope whoever does it has AIDS. You know, that line really stuck with me. But, back to the main part of the scene, which is, of course, the murder of Adrian Mellon. I also want to point out how, before the attack, Adrian is talking to his boyfriend about moving away from Derry. Or no, Don, I think, is the one who wants to move away from Derry. Because, you know, it does have a big homophobic history, and, you know, it's an ugly place in the sense that, there's a lot of hatred. And, you know, Adrian, who's the one who's wearing the I Love Derry hat, you know, he sort of, I guess, has a fondness for Derry. He does agree to move with him because that's what his boyfriend wants. But I think it's like, when they start beating and killing him, it's almost like, you know, he liked this town. Why are you doing this to him? It's like you're murdering one of your own, something like that. And, you know, like I said, it doesn't care. It enjoys it. It's almost like, you know, when you say that Derry is a part of it, it's like, this is how this town treats its citizens.
Another theme I definitely saw in the novel, and I don't know if you guys saw this theme, but another theme I saw is free will, and this idea of, like, in the novel you find out that there is another being called the Turtle who is its enemy, and you get the idea that at least when they were kids, the Turtle was the one who was guiding the Losers Club in their fight against it. But it kind of brought up this sense of, did these characters really have free will? Did they become friends with each other, like, because they genuinely would have become friends with each other, or was it all the Turtle manipulating that so they could come together? So, even though the Turtle is supposed to be good, you almost get this sense that the Losers Club were just pawns in the Turtle's game against it in a lot of ways. But I don't know what you think of that.
Well, I mean, I love a good free will versus determinism argument. I think in this case, it's really, like it usually is, it's up to you, really.
Yeah. Because I almost got an almost Lovecraftian sense from it, that all the people in this town are just pawns for these two supernatural beings that are almost beyond their understanding.
Yeah, which is that great Lovecraftian, like, none of us are really in control, nothing really matters, and we're just kind of ants in the grand scheme of things. Yeah. Which is scary in and of itself. But I think it's important to talk about free will, and whether or not, like, we make our own choices, or if we're playing parts, that kind of thing. It's cool to see it in this story, but much more subtle, not like forced or anything, or it being like the big part of the story. For me personally, I think it's interesting to think that these people were destined to meet each other.
Yeah. Not
in a way that they're pawns, just in a way that that's how it was meant to be, and that's how problems were overcome. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, you know, just to kind of think about the difference between, you know, free will and fate.
Yeah, what do you think of that?
I mean, to be honest, I never really thought much about that, but I like to believe that they came together of their own free will. rather than be pawns in the Turtle's scheme, because frankly I think the Turtle, while a good character, is kind of a dick. Because, no, I like to think that they came together of their own free will, I just... but, I mean, if you want to talk about free will in another area, maybe we could also talk about its control over the town. It kind of... I remember reading about how it doesn't let these murders get reported on a national scale. Mm-hmm. And it also, like you said before, it sort of subtly influences the adults' hatred and rage and all the bigotry. And I remember reading one part, I don't remember too much about it, but I do specifically remember where this woman in the town was concerned at first about one of the kids, but then you read, but that was none of her problem.
Yeah.
That kind of shows that it's sort of manipulating them into not caring.
Yeah, actually you could say societal apathy is kind of another theme in the story, like this idea that people, when they see something so bad, they don't even want to think about it, like they might even have a chance to help, but they're too afraid to help, or they don't care enough to help,
Yeah, there's a scene in the book where Beverly is being attacked by Henry Bowers, and one woman actually does try to help. She's like, hey, what are you doing? Leave her alone. But then she's in her car, and Henry kind of kicks her tail light and scares her off. And another old man doesn't even do anything. He just walks back into his house. Mm-hmm. So I guess even when they do try to help, it finds a way to silence them, which was in this case Henry kicking the tail light.
Now, in the novel, and we of course already mentioned the turtle, but there is a lot of deeper mythology in the story. Like, at a certain point, it really does become almost more of like a science fiction / dark fantasy novel. Like, you find out that the Big Bang that created the universe was actually caused by the turtle. The turtle essentially created the universe, but the turtle was also created by another being who is simply referred to as the Other, and you get the idea that the Other is the one guiding them as adults. Now, I've always gotten the implication that the Other was supposed to be God. Like, the turtle is definitely meant to be a representation of God, but, like, I always felt like the Other was either, like, God or where we got the idea of God from. Like, the mythology that Stephen King's playing around with here, it almost feels like a cross between Christianity and sort of a Lovecraftian mythos. But what do you think of the deeper mythology? And I know it threw a lot of people off, but what do you think of it?
I mean, I think it's weirdly fascinating, personally. Maybe it's just because I'm a fantasy fan, but it's cool the way that it sort of branches off into another thing. The losers are an extension of the turtle is an extension of the Other, or whatever.
Yeah.
I think the Other is definitely meant to be, like, he's not meant to fit into, like, your Christian concept of God, but he definitely is meant to be a God, he's a creator of all. But it's interesting to think of, like, just a void outside of everything with all these huge cosmic sentient beings in it, like, where it came from, and even digging a little bit into Stephen's repertoire, like the Crimson King and all this stuff.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think that we're sort of just like this sort of pinpoint that's just at the center of all this crazy shit. We're just like going about our lives in the center of all this.
Yeah, what do you think of the deeper mythology in the book?
I mean, to be honest, I never really got totally into it. When I think about it, I really just focus on sort of the main sort of plot, like, it and, the other characters, the losers, and, etc. I will say that, like I said before, I think the turtle is kind of a dick. Just because I do distinctly remember when Bill, as a child, is kind of whizzing through, time and space, and he comes across him and he says, "Please help us." And the turtle's just like, "Oh, no, I can't, kid." Sorry, kiddo.
Yeah. Even though I kind of got the sense that the turtle was kind of helping them already, I mean, maybe in more of a metaphysical sense, I would say. I think the turtle was kind of supposed to be the one who was giving them the power to fight it.
Yeah, but, I mean, could have given them a little more, too. I mean, it's like, dude, you're all powerful. Come on. You can't lend a freaking hand or flipper or whatever the hell that is.
Yeah.
But I mean, despite the fact that I think he's kind of a prick, you know, whatever help he does give them, that's still nice, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why, like, the stuff with the turtle and the other might throw people off, but I like it in the sense that you think it's just this small little story about a group of people in a small town fighting a demon, but you realize that in the grand scheme of things, it's tied into this larger cosmic story that, again, as I said in my plot description, spans billions of years.
To be honest, I think the whole cosmic stuff kind of overcomplicates it a bit.
I would agree with you if, like, maybe the novel was shorter, but because the novel's so long and there's so many... To me, this is such a multi-layered story that I can accept, like, when it goes really hardcore into, like, the sci-fi dark fantasy stuff.
But I think it really could have worked even without all the cosmic stuff. Like, if it was just, you know, a novel about the losers' fight with Pennywise as kids and as adults, you know, without any of the cosmic stuff whatsoever, I think that still could have worked just fine.
True,
You know,
fair enough.
I feel like this stuff wasn't needed, that's all.
Alright. Now, in the novel, you do eventually find out where it came from. I think there's still enough left ambiguous about it, especially because you find out its origin in a dream sequence, but you find out that it is actually some kind of an evil god from another dimension, from a space outside of our universe known as the Macroverse, and millions of years ago, during the time of the dinosaurs, it came to Earth, and it came to Earth in the form of a meteor and somehow became trapped in the area of land where the town of Derry would be built millions of years later. And this is not in the book necessarily, but this is sort of a fan theory of mine. I've always had the theory that before it came to Earth, it has also been to other planets in our universe before settling on Earth, because at one point it does say, "I am the eater of worlds." But I don't know what you would think of that theory or not.
No, it makes sense. I mean, maybe it's just because it knows it's capable of eating an entire world, simply for the fact that, you know, it's been doing this for so long. But I think it's pretty cool, to be honest. I think that this thing has just settled in the place that is Derry, and it's been there since prehistoric times.
Yeah.
Because think about, like, how wide-reaching it is, you know. The only reason it is a clown now is just because it changes as sort of society changes.
Yeah, this is a fan theory that I'm not sure if I agree with, but a lot of people have the theory that maybe at one point there actually was a clown named Pennywise who came to Derry, maybe it attached itself to this person. Again, that's nothing that's in the novel, that's just sort of what fans of the novel have interpreted.
Right. I think it makes a lot of sense, actually.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think its origin is very intriguing.
Do you think it's necessary, though? Because I'm kind of like, as much as I do like it in the book, I'm also like, part of me almost feels it would have been creepier if you never knew where this thing came from, but a part of me also really does like the origin. But what do you think of the necessity of its origin?
I'm sort of split on it, because on one hand, as I'm a big fan of the character of it, so therefore I want to know more about it, but on the other hand, I think, again, saying that it's this cosmic entity that crashed down to Earth, and I think that just overcomplicates it a little bit. You know, I'm not saying that Stephen King should have dumbed it down or anything. I'm just saying maybe not being as complicated. That's the best way I can put it.
You just don't like to think.
No, I like to think very much. But, no, I do like the idea that it has been around for millions of years, and it's been, like I said before, it considers Derry its feeding ground, its game preserve, you know, that's what it considers humans. It's been around for millions of years, and it's just been feeding on people and feeding on people and feeding on people for all these years, and that's terrifying. I must say, though, I do like that theory about the origin of its Pennywise form, where, you know, maybe there was a human named Bob Gray, and his job was to be a clown named Pennywise. Maybe the entity saw this and thought, wow, that would make a good form, and it adopted that. That would have been great. And this is something we'll obviously go into later, but I was very disappointed that they never went into that in Chapter 2.
Yeah.
But again, we'll get into that later, so I'll save that. my rage at that for now. But back to Pennywise's, its origin. I think it's good for what it is. Is it a little overcomplicated? Yes. And is it necessary? I'll say yes and no.
Now, as much as I adore this book, and this is a spoiler, but there is a scene at the end of this book that kind of requires discussion, and it's a scene that, again, as much as I love the book, I really can't defend. Basically, when it flashes back to them as children, and you find out how they defeated it as children, after they defeat it, they get lost in the sewer, and the idea that King's kind of playing around with here is that they all had a magical bond with each other, but after finally defeating it as kids, that bond was starting to deteriorate, but they needed that bond and that magic to help them get out of the sewer, so the way to renew that bond is basically they all end up having sex with Beverly. And I know, to be fair, in the book, it's somewhat plausible on paper, but just saying that out loud, it's like, you really can't defend it at all.
There's no easy way to say it. Like, it's just, you gotta just say it. The way that I think it's not meant to be titillating, okay? It's not like a disgusting, like, pedophilic type of thing to get off on. It's supposed to be, okay, let's take that step together. Let's become adults all in one go, you know? And
I think I understood it in the sense that it's a coming-of-age story, and there is a lot of sexuality involved in coming-of-age, and this is almost an extreme of that. Like, this is the extreme of what happens when you lose your virginity. Mm-hmm. I think that's how King might have been trying to justify it at the time. Right. But again, like, when you say it like that, I guess it's somewhat plausible, but it's something that really only works on paper and only works in a book, and it barely even works in the book, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I agree. And at least there was the kind of a sense of tenderness to it. It's not just like a disgusting, like, it's all fuck Bev in the sewer. Like, it's not like a creepy ass, like, you know, child porn type thing. And the funny thing is, you know, the way that people kind of still get around it is one of my favorite reading podcasts was mentioned it the other day. They were like, yeah, the dude was just on a lot of coke. And it probably caused him to make writing decisions that he wouldn't have in a kind of a clear frame of mind. So you see, like, both adaptations totally just, like, gloss over this, you know.
Yeah. Which was wise.
Yeah, I agree. I was kind of worried they were going to go for it with Chapter 2, the new version, and I'm glad they didn't at all. Because I know Fukunaga's version, they were going to do it. And I was like, no, dude, I get that you're trying to be close to it, but no, don't touch it. It's just gross, you know.
Jeremy, what do you think of the sewer scene?
I won't defend it, but I will say that at the time that Stephen King was writing this, he had a co-writer. And that co-writer was cocaine. It's like a lot of... I remember I was talking about the book with this young lady, and she actually said, you know, reading that scene, you feel like a pedophile when you read that. And I don't think that's, you know, what you're supposed to, you know, gain from that. It's like... That's not what Stephen King intended with that scene. What he intended with the scene was to show you that, you know, these kids were being forced to sort of grow up prematurely. And, you know...
That's actually a really good way to describe it.
Yeah, thank you. And that at that time, in the sewer, that, unfortunately, was the only way that they were able to do it. Do I necessarily approve of the scene? No, not really, but, you know, I'm not going to be like one of those people who I've seen online who just, you know, there are some people who just outright demonize King and say, oh, how can he write that? He's, you know, supporting, you know, pedophilia, he's doing this, he's doing that. No, he's not doing that. That's absurd.
If this is news to you about, like, King's drug habits and all this stuff, let me just give you some context. He can't remember writing Cujo. Like, it's completely blacked out from his memory to the point where he reads it and he's reading something he's never written. Like, it was that bad. So it was just a drug haze during that period of his life, and it gave us some good storytelling, but also gave us some creepy ass shit.
And like the fact that, like, if you assume he was on cocaine throughout writing a lot of this book, though, besides that scene, most of the book is so beautifully written that it's hard to believe that he wasn't sober, you know?
Well, the funny thing is, I've heard a lot of marijuana users say that, who are writers, say that, like, they come up with amazing stuff when they get off. And I feel like there is a cognizance that's still there, but somehow it gets you to an insane place. But I'm not condoning that anybody do it or anything, but I think that it has this weird sort of ethereal effect on people that kind of might help with certain writers, because I've heard them say that it makes them feel more productive as writers, which is interesting. But, yeah.
He, I believe, has actually defended it. I remember hearing something about him saying, like, it always amazes me how people have such a problem with this scene, and yet they have no problem whatsoever with all the scenes of kids getting gruesomely murdered.
This is something very sexual involving a bunch of 11 and 12-year-olds. Like, you can't... It's very hard to justify that, I think.
Of course it is.
Now, a lot of Stephen King's books actually take place in the same universe, and a lot of them interlock with each other, and it is no exception. It actually shares quite a few links with some of King's other books. For example, Shawshank State Prison, which was the setting of Stephen King's novella Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, is mentioned quite a bit in this book, actually. Also, another connection, and this is a big one, is Dick Harlan from The Shining, who you already mentioned, shows up in the part of this book that's about the fire at the Black Spot. Now, that part of the book is set in the 1930s, so it's obviously taken place years and years before the events of The Shining. Another Shining connection is... I never personally picked this up, but a lot of people have interpreted the Losers Club as having the shine.
Yeah, it makes sense, because, I mean, Bev keeps having premonitions of the future. They all have that kind of latent sort of sense of each other and all that stuff.
And maybe if they do have the shine, maybe that's how the turtle was able to work through them to, defeat it. Yeah,
and maybe it gives some greater credence to the fact that them all banding together is what took down Pennywise. It makes sense if they were all shiners too. So, as much as the story is about banding together to overcome things,
And even in the part of the book that's about the fire at the Black Spot, it's very much implied that Dick used the Shining to help Mike's father get out of the fire.
Right, yeah.
Also, there's a scene in this book where Beverly mentions a serial killer from the town of Castle Rock who murdered all these women, and she's of course referring to the character of Frank Dodd from The Dead Zone, who was also mentioned in Cujo. That was also a really cool connection.
A lot of people think that Cujo was actually possessed by Frank Dodd.
Yeah.
In that book, which is one of my more favorite theories, even though it's kind of random, but...
Well, Frank Dodd is mentioned quite a bit throughout that novel. Also, in Stephen King's novel Misery, there are parts of that book where there are flashbacks to Paul Sheldon's childhood, and it does mention that his mother was friends with a woman named Mrs. Kasprack, so maybe that was Eddie Kasprack's mother. I mean... Or it could have been just a relative of Eddie Kasprack, or maybe just somebody with the same last name.
Exactly.
But there is a possible it connection in Misery.
Yeah, there's no coincidences, I think.
Yeah. Now, I've never read the Tommyknockers, but apparently there is an it connection in the Tommyknockers. I heard there's a scene where a character is actually driving through Derry, but he's hallucinating, and he actually sees a clown at one point. That's hilarious. At that point, like, he is hallucinating, so maybe it's it, maybe it's not it, Now, this book also shares some major links with Stephen King's sci-fi fantasy series, The Dark Tower. For example, the turtle from this book shows up in the Dark Tower series, and you find out in that series that the turtle is one of the Guardians of the Beam. Now, there are other Guardians, and since the turtle created the universe in this book, it's unclear in the Dark Tower series whether the other Guardians also have the ability to create universes, or if it's only the turtle. It's also unclear whether the turtle created the entirety of the multiverse, because the Dark Tower series deals with the concept of multiple universes, so it's unclear whether he created all of them or just the one specific universe that it takes place in. But in the Dark Tower series, sort of the main creative force behind the universe or the multiverse is a being called Gan, who in that series is implied to be God. But tying it in with the Dark Tower series, you could say that the other was actually Gan. But what do you think of all the Dark Tower connections?
I love it. It's one of the great things about following his books so avidly. You see kind of the big picture seep into the smaller, like, tinier stories. This is probably a big, I think, kind of keystone of all the books with the macroverse and the other and all that. But
yeah, in the macroverse, in the Dark Tower, you find out about these spaces between the worlds known as the Ta-Darkness. So you could say that the macroverse is maybe a part of the Ta-Darkness, or it could be a part of the Prim, which in the Dark Tower series is sort of this primordial darkness that existed before Gan or God created the multiverse.
Right, yeah.
Jeremy, you haven't read the Dark Tower, right? So
no, I have not.
So all this is probably going way over your head.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see Todash as being part of the Prim or part of the macroverse. It was, for me, Todash was always the space between space.
Yeah, but that's kind of what the macroverse is, sort of.
It feels like more like the macroverse is kind of like the big entrance, whereas like Todash is like the vestibule. You know, that's the way I look at it anyway. Because like there's this place for like these huge cosmic beings, and then there are these tinier spaces that if you walk into, fucking scary ass flying monsters will eat you.
Yeah,
it's like these like different layers of reality. You know, it's like peeling back like the layers of an onion almost. Mm-hmm. That's just the way that I look at it.
Now, the Dark Tower series doesn't just connect to it; it actually connects to all of Stephen King's other books and short stories, even the stories that are clearly not in the same universe, because it's a series that deals with the concept of parallel Earths and alternate timelines. Even his post-apocalyptic novels like The Stand, The Mist, and Cell still tie in with the Dark Tower series. Even his dystopian novels like The Running Man and The Long Walk, you could say, tie in. They're just set on different parallel Earths, what's known in the series as different levels of the tower. And also, the main villain of the Dark Tower series is this interdimensional demon called the Crimson King, who seems to be a very similar creature to what it is, because the Crimson King can shapeshift, and the Crimson King also takes on the form of a giant spider. And it is implied in the series that the Crimson King is actually the devil. That's never really confirmed. It's more of an implication you're supposed to get, like, he's either Satan or maybe where we got the idea of Satan from. But it does appear that the Crimson King might be the one who was pulling Pennywise's strings the whole time. Also, in Dark Tower 6, Song of Susanna, there is a part where a certain character mentions the Crimson King, but does refer to the Crimson King as it. Also, the Crimson King in the last Dark Tower novel has a son named Mordred, who does take on the form of a humanoid spider. Another implication that the Crimson King and it are sort of, like, maybe not the same entity, but of the same species of demon.
They seem to have an awareness of each other, too, because if you read Insomnia...
Yes.
Yeah, the Crimson King seems to shout out to Pennywise at one point, because he says something about, didn't you know that transformation is a running gag in Derry?
Time-honored custom in Derry.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, Insomnia is the book. I am going to bring that up in a little bit, but Insomnia is the book where you do kind of get the implication that the Crimson King might have been working behind the scenes during the events of it. Mm-hmm. Also, because so many of Stephen King's books do take place in the same multiverse, there are so many other villains from his books and short stories that you could say could potentially be the same type of creature as Pennywise and the Crimson King, like He Who Walks Behind the Rose from Children of the Corn, or Attack from Desperation and the Regulators. I am saying the name of that character, right? The worm creature from the short story Jerusalem's Lot, which was a prequel to Salem's Lot.
Yeah, it's interesting, because you think about how many times you've seen that monster with this kind of similar skill set, but always like somewhat different, but that kind of fits into Pennywise's MO. You know, it makes you think just how many times maybe we haven't seen the same character, but just how many of those characters were like working on the same level.
And then you already brought this book up, but Stephen King, a few years after it, wrote a book called Insomnia, which, honestly, if you read that book right after it really does almost feel like a spiritual sequel to it, because it's also set in Derry. Mike Hanlon actually makes a brief appearance in Insomnia, and there's a lot of really cool Easter eggs in that book. If you've read it, like, they reference Nebolt Street in that book, they reference some of the events from it, and in that book you do sort of get the implication that a part of it might still be alive in Derry.
That's right.
Also, his book Dreamcatcher, there are parts of that book that take place in Derry. Sure. In some ways, you could almost consider it, Insomnia, and Dreamcatcher to be like the Derry trilogy. Mm-hmm. Isn't there like a reference to Pennywise in Dreamcatcher? I actually haven't read it yet.
Yeah, I forget if it's a statue in Derry, I think, and then somebody looks at the base of it and somebody spray painted Pennywise Lives on it. And you're not supposed to know whether or not somebody was fucking around or whether somebody is genuinely trying to say Pennywise is still hanging around.
Yeah.
But it's like a funny in-joke, obviously if you know what it's from. But yeah, it's a cool idea, just the fact that we're back in Derry means you might as well give a shout out to it,
Derry's also mentioned in so many of his other books, like it's mentioned in Pet Sematary, it's mentioned in Gerald's Game, it's mentioned in Hearts in Atlantis, in Storm of the Century. In Stephen King's novel 11/22/63, there's a scene where the main character does go to Derry and he actually meets some members of the Losers Club actually shortly after their first battle with it when they were kids. You've read that book, right?
Yeah, that's right. It was Ben and Bev. It was towards the end of the book, so it was a cool, like, all right, you made it this far. Here's a cool little Easter egg type thing. But in his whole body of work, that's a relatively like recent book, so it was cool to see, like, even this far forward now, we're still getting cool little references to other books and stuff. It's nice that they're always in his head,
Now, this wasn't actually written by Stephen King, but it's based on a lot of Stephen King's work. Recently, you had the Hulu series Castle Rock, which is supposed to be set within the Stephen King multiverse, but Season 2 pretty much confirms that the show is taking place in sort of an alternate timeline. If you want to tie it in with Dark Tower, maybe another level of the tower. But the reason I'm bringing the show up is because there are some subtle connections to it in that show. Mm-hmm. You've seen the first season, right?
Yeah, I've seen the first season and the first 2 episodes of Season 2. It's been pretty good so far.
Some fans have speculated, I don't personally agree with this theory, but some fans have speculated that the kid, who is the main villain of Season 1, who's played by Bill Skarsgård, some have speculated that the kid is actually Pennywise in a different form.
Yeah.
I don't personally agree with that. I actually think he's an incarnation of Randall Flagg myself.
That would make sense. Yeah. I can totally see it. I mean, there's a reason they wanted Bill to play that role, because what's great about that show is they've done such a good job of having it be a love letter to everything Stephen King. They've gotten like old cast members to come back and play new roles and all this stuff. Bill was in between Pennywise, and they have him coming back playing this character who nobody really knows anything about, has been around for 27 years, and is being kept locked underneath a town. It was very obvious and deliberate what they were doing. I'm surprised, honestly, he wanted to do it because it was such a deliberate, obvious homage. But they did it so differently enough that he was still willing to do it and found it interesting as an actor.
Yeah.
So I guess it's pretty cool to see that shout out go. But it still feels like he's playing a very different character on that show. So it helps.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed our epically long review on the book It. I want to cut to a few short reviews that some friends of mine did on this book. When we come back, we're going to talk about the film and television adaptations of this book. And Jeremy, I know you're pretty excited to talk about that.
Oh, yes, I am.
It's odd to say that a book is perfect, because in reality, nothing in life should be perfect. Everything should be flawed in some way or another, even if the flaw or flaws are minor. But in all honesty, I can't find a single flaw in Stephen King's It. To me, it's a perfect book, a perfect story, all around. I can't find a single negative thing in it, and I've read it well over 5 times in my lifetime, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you have never seen the size of the book, then you won't know that that's actually saying something. It's a long-as hell book. I'm talking about, it's almost as long as The Stand, which is about 1,000 pages or more, something like that. And the fact that it keeps up the greatness through the entire length is also saying something. It never drags on, it's interesting the whole way through, and even more than that, it's fun, it's emotional, it's creepy, and disturbing at times. From the very beginning of the book, it just pulls you in. I mean, from the very first sentence, it just really just pulls you into the story, and instantly you're in this world, instantly you're with these characters, and instantly you want to know what's going on, what's happening. It begins with one of the greatest sentences of all time: "The terror which would not end for another 28 years, if it ever did end, began, so far as I know or can tell, with a boat made from a sheet of newspaper floating down a gutter swollen with rain." And from right there, you're just like, F yeah, Stephen King, let's do this. I want to know why this little boat is floating down a gutter swollen with rain. And I really couldn't put it down after that. Oh my God, it was just so much fun reading this book. I had such a great time. The book is split into 2 parts. So instantly, I was just like, okay, that's interesting because it begins with the kids when they're kids. And then, of course, when they grow up later on, 27 years later. And the first part really drew me in because it was like the books I was reading at the time, these coming-of-age stories. Stephen King does that really well. The Losers Club, you get to see into their lives, and when they come together and, deal with the mystery of it and all that stuff, that's fine, but just their lives, just the way they interact with each other, just the way that they find each other and find a family, amongst themselves is beautiful. I love that. It really, really just was really emotional for me. I just really loved it because I remember having friends at the time that were like that, and it really, really stuck with me. And then when you get to the sequel part, and you're reading when they're adults and they have to come back together to fight it again, is really about survival. It's really about the aftermath of one of these horror stories. You see that in Lovecraft, and it was nice that Stephen King kind of brought that over into his own work. Stephen King really is a master of what he does. I thought he just, really did that so well in this book. And of course, this is the perfect chance for me to talk about, speaking of survival, the character of it, the Pennywise the Dancing Clown. Stephen King, his villains, I've always loved his villains because his villains are so out of this world, and yet they're so, there's parts of them you can understand sometimes where they come from, especially if you read their backstories, and you do get into where it comes from in this book as well. I just really like how he fleshes out these villains as well and how evil they are, because sometimes, I notice some books, they don't want to go that far with stuff, or movies especially, they don't want to go into a villain and make him that evil. But Stephen King never holds back, which is so much fun. He just goes right for it, and that's great. It takes guts, and I love that. And, the whole time when you're trying to figure out what it is, no pun there, it's just fun. I really enjoyed that. I just love it. I love this book. I love just talking about this book. It is fantastic. Please read it. Check it out. And yes, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Hello out there in YouTube land. Mark Allen Gunnels here. My friend Christian has asked me to do a short video review of the Stephen King novel, It. And more than happy to do so because it is a novel that I absolutely love. I actually first read it back when I was in high school, which was a lot longer ago than I really want to admit. Checked it out from the library. It was actually the first Stephen King novel I ever read. And I liked it enough that I became a voracious Stephen King fan after that and just started reading everything he had out. And I thought it was a very engrossing novel that just completely captured my imagination, and the characters felt very real to me. I actually reread the novel last year as a man in my 40s and found my appreciation for it had grown even more. When I read it as a teen, I felt like I agreed with most people who say that the adult sections weren't as good as the kid sections. Reading it now, I disagreed. I thought the adult sections were every bit as engrossing because I understood them more. Some of the things I love about this novel is the structure of it, the way that it's constantly switching back and forth between the past and the present. The miniseries they released in the 90s tried to keep that structure a little bit. The movies, that came out recently, not so much. But even the miniseries couldn't quite capture the beautiful intricacy of the way he weaved between past and present. The structure of the novel really was brilliant. The character work is so good. He gets so in-depth with these characters. They feel like people you know. They feel like people you care about. It gets you invested in the story. And what I really love about this novel is some of the stuff people complain about. And that's the just bizarre complexity of it. actually the origins of the creature that is Pennywise the clown. The opposing force that sort of brings the kids together to battle him. It's very bizarre, but very, I think, unique and interesting and fascinating. There's also this weird, like, Smokehouse Vision Quest section where they learn about Pennywise. And then the actual final battle is a very mental ritual that they're battling, basically a battle of wills and minds. All that stuff is so odd, and yet it makes the novel, I think, elevates it. There's even a section when they're kids, after they fight Pennywise and get lost in the sewers, something that happens to sort of renew their bond just enough for them to find their way back out. A lot of people criticize that, and it is incredibly bizarre and unexpected. And yet, I think it actually has its own internal logic, and it's so much more interesting than just, and then they found their way out. I think so much of this novel is so weird, but in a beautiful way. I really do love that about the book. And I love that, it is over 1,000 pages, but never leaves me bored. And I mean, there are things, conversations the kids have about religion at one point. Does absolutely nothing to forward the plot of the story. But a story is more than plot. Plot is only a part of the story. I think it gives it a reality, it gives you a wider world than just the plot. All that stuff I think is wonderful. So yeah, It by Stephen King I think is a brilliant book, and I really love it.
What's up, guys? How's it going? Sorry for that little creepy slide in right there, but I didn't know how else to come on into it. I didn't want to just be right here. I'm Matt. I'm known as Happy Chemtrails on YouTube. And recently I was asked from Canto 1408 to be a part of this video. He knows I love the book It. And I accepted because of that and because I love his reviews and I love his channel. So definitely subscribe to Canto 1408 because I love his movie reviews, his book reviews, his skits, his comic book reviews. Even if I don't know the book or the movie that he's talking about, I'll still watch the video anyway, and it gives me insightful information whether or not I should start that book or watch that movie. So definitely check out his channel all the time. Keep those notifications on. But yes, talking about It, I'm going to keep it a little short because I know he's already probably going to review it. He asked me to make like a little 3-minute, 4-minute video. I don't even know if I'm going to get that far. I might. I don't know. I'm just literally letting the camera roll. I was going to write something out for it too, but I felt like I would just rather, speak freely. So you're going to hear a lot of ums. Or those too. But yeah, the book It from 1986, Stephen King's masterpiece. I love it. I really do. It's my favorite book of all time, mainly because it was the book that got me into reading. I didn't like reading before I read it. I read because it was almost like, a school thing. Like, oh, you're going to read this book, then you're going to do a report on it. Or you're going to read this book, and then you're going to answer questions on it. I didn't like that. So my junior year, I already knew the mini-series of it. And people have talked about it. People have told me to read the book. And I finally was like, you know what? I love Tim Curry. Let's read the book because it'll give me, I guess, more understanding of why it is so universal to a lot of people. If people talk about it, they go, oh, I love that book, or oh, that book's fucking terrifying. I wanted to, get my own opinion in there, and I really loved it. I started it, I couldn't stop it, even though it took me a little bit to finish. It took me like a month or two. Yeah, I think it took me like 2 months to finish, but I was reading it avidly, and I mean, I was 17, I didn't really like reading, so for me to actually get through that book in 2 months, that was an accomplishment for me. But I really love the characters in this book. I love the kid characters the most. They're the ones that stand out to me. They remind me of Stand By Me, so it's really cool seeing those characters connect to each other, and the way that they play off of each other and how they talk to each other. It's definitely how kids would act. I don't know about 50s kids because the book takes place in the late 50s. I don't know because I wasn't there, but it seems like that's how kids would be. I remember when I was a kid and I was relating to it very heavily, and I didn't want any of them to get hurt. I didn't want them, to be affected by the bullies or the monster that is it, or Pennywise, or, whatever form it was taking. But, yeah, the book really does play with your fears. Plays with a lot of fears, main fears. A lot of people are afraid of clowns. I'm afraid of clowns. A lot of people are afraid of spiders. I'm afraid of spiders. So the book was definitely scary to me. Also, it was the first and only book that I read where I felt like I was being watched while I was reading it. I don't know if that adds to the value of scare factor, but it definitely freaked me out reading the book. It gave me anxiety. It was very unsettling. But then there was parts where your heart, it melted a little bit. You wanted to, think that this wasn't a horror book. And then it turned out to be a horror book. So then it's like, oh, shit. Like, oh, I forgot the clown was after them, There was times where you could almost take a breath. And then there was times where you couldn't even breathe. I have read a few other of his books, and I think that nothing compares to this book. This is a very big, long, thick book. So reading it, you got to know that you're going to get a lot of backstory, so you get a lot of it. You get more than the movies or the TV miniseries will be able to portray, just for the fact alone that it is a telephone book. You're reading a giant, thick book. But this book will stay my favorite, I feel like. I don't think any book will come along anytime soon, at least, to change my opinion. But I really do love the movies as well, and the miniseries. Love Tim Curry. I love the new movies where it got the rated R rating. So I was really excited for that because I knew the miniseries held back a lot, especially after I read the book. I was like, wow, they made a TV series out of it, like a TV movie? And why would they do that? The book was so fucked up. So, yeah, definitely check it out. Even if you have watched the miniseries or the new movies, you still haven't read the book, and that is a pinnacle. You need to read the book because it is definitely different. It is something that you need to experience page for page instead of scene for scene. So definitely check it out. I give this book a 10 out of 10. I'm going to keep it short. I'm going to end it right there with that because I feel like Kanto is going to go into his opinions, and he's going to dive deeper. I'm just going to leave it at it's a 10 out of 10. I really do appreciate Kanto for letting me in this video. So I'm going to leave it at that. Read the book if you haven't read it, because if you haven't, you're fucking mistaking yourself. Alright, I'll catch you later.
Hi, I'm Brittany. I'm friends with Christian, and I read it, and I'm just here to go over some of the stuff. There are a couple themes that I'm aware of, and I definitely didn't come up with them on my own. But there's basically the theme of Stephen King sort of wrapping up his theme of writing about horror and writing about childhood in the books and like previous books, and this was sort of his last like wrap up to all that, or his thesis on everything. Yeah, there is a lot of racism and homophobia in the book, but I'm definitely not on board with most people who say like they think Stephen King is racist. I think he definitely uses it to reinforce that these characters are evil, because he doesn't really have like a gray area with good and evil. It's sort of like very black and white for him. So if anybody's like racist, or if they're even misogynistic in ways too, or controlling, they're pretty much the evil character. I think he uses that to sort of like drive that home. Yeah. So yeah, I think Ben is my favorite character, and I feel like in the movies they don't really bring him in as much as I would like him to be, because I think that he's a pretty big staple in the book, and I think he's one of my favorite characters. I think he brings like a lot of knowledge into the Losers Club, and I think his little thing with Bev is amazing, and I love all of it. But I think that in the movies he's sort of a side character, and even the character, the actor that got to play him in the movie, I think in the new movie, obviously, not the 1990s version, but in the newer movie, I feel like they just kind of have him as a side piece, and that kind of upsets me a little bit, because I think he's such an amazing character. And I think one of my favorite parts in the book is his walk home from school, and he sees on the frozen lake, he sees Pennywise the clown, and that part for me just is like a really awesome part of the book. And I kind of wish that was in the movie. I wish that that was a scene in the movie. Yeah, like reading the book and also in the movie, I thought the Paul Bunyan part was kind of lame. Like, not lame, but in a way, I was like, this doesn't really scare me, not as much as the other parts scared me in the books and the movie, until I got to Bangor, Maine, which is also Derry, Maine, and I stood in front of the statue that inspired Stephen King to write that scene in the book, and then I finally got it, because this thing is massive, and it's like, I can understand being scared if this thing came alive and started walking towards me, or even if I looked away for a second and then opened my eyes and saw this thing walking towards me, I'd have the shit scared out of me. So that part in the book definitely didn't hit me as hard as when I went there. I would definitely recommend anyone who's a fan of this book to go and visit Bangor, Maine, and do the tour and look at everything, because it's really cool, and it really makes you sort of see the things that inspired him to write the scenes in the book. It's pretty cool.
Did you see any demon clowns when you were there?
I did not see any demon clowns there, but I was hoping to. Didn't see any of them. I saw Stephen King's house. Pretty cool. With the turtle, when I first heard about it, I was a little bit confused about it, and I was a little bit like, what does this mean? Hearing about it with Dark Tower, because I did spoil it for myself a bit, even though I haven't read about it yet, I do know that there's a deeper meaning to the turtle, and knowing that there's more to go over about him, I am excited to do that. And I think it's sort of, if it just happened in it and I was like, this is random, and they never brought it back up again, I think it would have bothered me. But knowing that I'm going to be able to learn more about what he's about is kind of cool, and I like that Stephen King brought him in, especially with the intent to learn more about him later on.
So Stephen King's It happens to be one of my favorites of his novels. I think it was my 7th novel that I read, and I fell in love with it. Now basically, Stephen King does a lot with children, and I feel like It is one of his major novels that he discusses childhood. So, you know, It is definitely a horror story, you know, with Pennywise, the evil clown and everything. But I think a lot of people will agree it's more of a coming-to-age story. Other than, like, Pennywise, the evil clown, you know, I want to talk about the actual horrors of the story. So there's racism, there's family abuse. Like Beverly's dad, he would abuse her constantly. There was thought that he could have sexually abused her as well. In fact, there was one thing mentioned by Beverly's mother, and she only mentioned it once, but it was very clear. She was like, does he ever touch you? And Beverly didn't really understand it, and her mom was like, oh, never mind. So when Beverly grew up, she married this guy, Tom Logan, and doing that, she pretty much married someone who was exactly like her father. Like, you find out that the husband beats her, sexually abuses her, rapes her pretty much, and some connections to other King's work I want to mention is that basically the cook in The Shining actually appears in It as a soldier, and basically he helps Mike's dad. One other connection to King's work is Christine. A lot of people don't realize it, but Christine was actually in It as the 1957 Red Plymouth. That when Henry Bowers grows up, he's in an insane asylum, and his dead friend Belch Huggins, he actually like comes to him in Christine to like help him out, break free. And another major connection is within the Dark Tower. Now, something I want to mention about that is little baby Mordred. See, he's kind of the son of the Crimson King, and what he is, he's like a little humanoid spider, and it's very similar to what its final form is that we can see without dying, pretty much. So the turtle, Merturn, is basically, you know, he holds the world on his back. And basically, Merturn is the good versus It, which is the bad.
So I hope you guys enjoyed my friend's short reviews on this book. Real quick, before we talk about the movies, I do want to mention that there's the band Pennywise, which obviously they named their band after the main villain of this book. I've actually never listened to anything from that band, but I just wanted to mention them because they are something that was inspired by this book, even if it is just in name only. Are either of you familiar with that band?
No, I'm not.
Alright. I think my friend Matt is a pretty big fan of them. But this book was adapted in 1990 into a made-for-TV miniseries. It was actually a two-part miniseries directed by Tommy Lee Wallace, who prior to that directed Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, and Fright Night Part 2. The miniseries, I'll admit, I've actually been very hard on the miniseries over the years, and a lot of my problems with it really are just kind of nerdy nitpicks, because I don't think it does justice to the book, but on its own, it really is a well-done movie, especially the first half. The second half definitely has its problems, but I don't think the second half is as bad as people have made it out to be. Honestly, I think people are way harder on the miniseries than it deserves. I actually think it's held up a lot better than people have given it credit for. But what do you guys think of the 1990 version of it?
I like it a lot, to be honest. I think that for the time it was made, it's pretty fun for like a TV budget adaptation, especially for something that's so expansive. This big, like, you know, close to 2,000-page book that.
Well, it's not that long; it's 1,000 pages.
I was like rounding up, admittedly, but it was. It was so surprising that they were able to condense it in a way that was coherent. You know, it was TV, but at the same time, it was impressive that they pulled it off.
Again, personally, to do justice to that book, it would have to be at least a 4-part miniseries. But for what they did, again, I actually don't think this is that bad. I think it's a pretty well-done adaptation. I do want to point out that this adaptation was written by Lawrence D. Cohen, who actually wrote the screenplay for Brian De Palma's adaptation of Stephen King's Carrie.
Oh, that's cool.
But Jeremy, what do you think of It 1990?
Oh, I really enjoy it. It's really, I'd say it's really well made. It's, you know, it's scary. It's at times very moving. And it's got a great cast, and you know, Tim Curry is just incredible.
That's something that a lot of people seem to agree on. Even people who don't really like the movie that much, they all seem to agree that Tim Curry is almost the perfect Pennywise. And I have to say, he really is. Like, also, his Pennywise really is what made a lot of people of our generation freaking terrified of clowns.
Oh, yes.
Like, I knew this girl in high school who had a fear of clowns, and when I was reading the book, she actually got me to turn the book over so she wouldn't have to look at the cover. And she said it was actually the movie It that got her to be afraid of clowns.
Of course.
Yeah.
It did that for a lot of people.
Yeah.
No, but Tim Curry is fantastic. I mean, I love his charisma. I love the creepy, you know, voice he gives to it.
Yeah, but he's creepy, but also he is funny. He's genuinely pretty funny in this movie.
Well, yeah, he is very charismatic, and he is, you know, I think one of the things he does best is he really captures Pennywise's mocking personality. You know, he shows that it really enjoys mocking them and taunting them. Mm-hmm. You know, and it loves what it does. And he really portrays that very well.
I do want to point out that before Tommy Lee Wallace directed this was originally going to be a 4-part miniseries, and it was actually originally going to be directed by George A. Romero.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that, because I actually asked him about this when I met him, and he told me it wasn't true.
Maybe people are getting it confused, because I know George Romero was at one point going to direct The Stand, but that fell through. There's a lot of projects based on Stephen King books that Romero was going to do that never happened. I heard Romero at one point was also going to direct Pet Sematary, but that never happened. But how do you think Romero, if it is true that he was going to direct an adaptation of it, how do you think he would have handled it?
Well, I think he would have handled it brilliantly. I mean, have you ever seen The Dark Half?
Oh, I love The Dark Half.
Yeah, he did that incredibly well.
Yeah, he is a gift for Stephen's work that I don't think ever got fully realized. Because like Creepshow is one of my all-time favorites. You know, Dark Half is an underrated gem. You know, so I think they should have worked together more, in all honesty, a lot more.
Now, in the movie, they do cut out the turtle and a lot of the stuff about Pennywise's origin, but there are some subtle hints to it. Like, at one point in the second half, Mike says that he felt there was something helping them that summer, but he's not sure if they created it or if it came there to help us. So I feel like that is sort of the miniseries subtly alluding to the turtle without actually saying what it is. And then, like, with its origin, you never really find out where it came from in this movie, but it does say, I am the eater of worlds at one point. So there are some subtle hints of the cosmic mythology in this. What do you think of that, like removing the turtle and all that?
I mean, it makes sense, because how are you going to portray something on that scale, you know, on a show like this?
Yeah.
It's tough. I mean, you've seen... I guess like the Langoliers would be a good example. Like the CGI in that is
I think
probably would have been on par with whatever the turtle would have looked like.
Oh yeah, I think definitely if they had the turtle in this, it would have been a god awful effect.
It would have bit off way more than they could chew. So it makes sense that you want to just sort of dial that down.
Yeah,
I honestly I'm actually glad that they left all that cosmic crap out.
All right.
It would have been a bad special effect, and it would have overcomplicated everything. And honestly, I don't think this story really even needs it. As I mentioned before, I just felt it was so unnecessary. I mean, it's like, this is a story about a demonic entity that feeds on the children of Derry. That's honestly all I need. I don't need all this other stuff about it came from outer space. There's this other godlike being named the Turtle, this, that. It's complicating everything.
Alright.
Funny though, I like that you mentioned how it says that it's the Eater of Worlds, because I mean, I just gotta say, that scene is so great. Especially, Tim Curry also shows Pennywise's sense of humor when, after Bill says, kill it, he says, kill me! Oh, you are priceless brat! I am eternal, child. I am the Eater of Worlds and of children, and you are next.
I also love in the movie how it's always raining or it's always overcast, and that adds this real gloomy tone and atmosphere to the movie. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's funny you mention that, because in the scene where Georgie is chasing the paper boat, and it's raining, you can actually tell that was filmed on a very beautiful sunny day.
All right.
It's not raining at all. That's just a little fun fact for you. But back to the scene with Georgie and Pennywise. I think it was mostly well done in the miniseries, but it could have been better. You see, one of the miniseries' major flaws is that because it was a made-for-TV miniseries made in 1990, they really couldn't show as much horror as the book required.
True, but you know what? For the time, this was honestly pretty groundbreaking for a made-for-TV movie,
sure.
Because, this is dealing with child murder. That's subjects you didn't really see on TV at the time.
I don't doubt that.
And it didn't really... Well, it was a great scene in the book. Did we really need to know that Georgie's arm was bitten off?
Disagree on that. I thought that him describing in the book Georgie's arm getting ripped off, that he described it like, there was that one final crunch and then it tore off. That adds to the terror.
Yeah.
But even so, even without it, I still think the sewer scene with Georgie works very well because of, one thing, of course, Tim Curry's performance. Another, because of the musical score, which throughout the miniseries is fantastic. I think.
I love the music in this movie.
It was done by a man named, I think, Richard Bellis. And, at times it can be very beautiful and emotional and moving, and at other times it can be really, low-key and creepy and just outright scary. And here, I kind of like how the music starts out as, loud and joyous and playful, but then once Pennywise rears his ugly head, it just becomes lower and more ominous.
Yeah.
And more kind of like a music you'd hear at a very dark carnival.
Mm-hmm.
I still enjoy watching the scene. I just wish it didn't cut away right as he's about to bite off the arm. But
one thing this miniseries, more so the first half, did very well is they got great child actors to play the kids.
Oh yeah, I agree with that.
Especially Jonathan Brandis, who it's a real shame what happened to him.
yeah, he gives a great performance in this, and it just reminds you of what a terrible loss his unfortunate suicide was. You know, his best scene in the movie is when, you know, they're all, I think they're in the Barrens. It's after they've seen Pennywise in the scrapbook, and he starts to tear up, gets emotional, and says, you know, you killed my little brother George.
You bastard!
Let's see you now. Let's see you now. That is a very powerful scene. I mean, they're all pretty good. You know, Emily Perkins, who I would later enjoy in Ginger Snaps, she does a good Beverly. Seth Green, who became the most famous out of all the child actors, he's pretty good as Richie. You know, he does the voices and the impressions pretty well. It's actually interesting to note that I think in real life, Seth Green, as an adult, he's actually quite short, whereas Harry Anderson, who plays, you know, adult Richie, is quite tall. That's just a little funny trivia. Brandon Crane, he's a very likable Ben.
What do you think of Jared, what's his last name?
Lankard.
Yeah, who plays Henry Bowers.
Oh, he does a great job. He is very intimidating.
Yeah. I think the movie downplayed just how messed up in the head Henry Bowers is, but either way, Jared does a great job in this movie. Chris, what do you think of the child actors in this?
Oh, they're amazing. I think they got really lucky with casting, because like the adults don't necessarily resemble their younger counterparts, but you could see how they could have grown into those people. Yeah, you know, it's really tough to kind of get lucky on that, because sometimes like the whole thing just falls apart if you don't have the right people. You know, so like like Seth is great as Richie, and he's definitely my favorite out of all of them, just because I'm kind of biased towards the dude. But
alright, yeah. What do you think of the adult actors playing the adult versions of them?
I think most of them do a great job, you know. Richard Thomas I really love as Bill. He shows a vulnerability in a lot of scenes, and he also got the stutter down very well.
Except he wasn't bald. He should have been bald.
Yeah, what the hell was with that yuppie ponytail?
I gotta be honest, I don't know if I'm 100% on him.
Alright.
It's the fact that he doesn't really match the physical description of Bill in the comics at all. The book at all is kind of one thing that throws me off. But I think everybody, performance-wise, does nail it. He's the only one that doesn't quite do it for me. I think, like Bev, who a lot of people recognize as the mom from Smallville, she's very well cast. She I think nails it. And the guy playing Richie, grown-up Richie, is amazing. Yeah. He's I think a little bit more maybe neurotic than Richie in the book is, but yeah, I think everybody's kind of on point.
Now, Jeremy, I know we talked off camera. You don't agree with Chris on Annette O'Toole.
Oh, I do not.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, I mean, Annette O'Toole I think is a good actress in general, but here, some of her line... deliveries, thank you, are just, they're awful. I mean,
why does it hate? Why is it so mean?
I think it's more like why does it have to hate? Why does it have to be so mean?
Yeah, I will say some of the adult actors were very melodramatic, where it seemed like the child actors were taking it way more seriously than the adults. Although John Ritter was amazing as adult Ben.
Oh my god, I love John Ritter. He's so great in everything. And his death was such a tragic loss. But here, you know, Ben, being the fat kid, is meant to be a very sympathetic character, and I think John Ritter had a lot of that sweetness in him. And, you know, where you can really believe that Brandon Crane's Ben grew up into John Ritter's Ben. You know, he has a lot of tender moments with Bev, and... you know, he also conveys Ben's terror very well. You know, like, when he first gets the call from Mike, he's, like, in utter devastation, to the point where he says to his girlfriend at the time, who asks if he's going to kill himself, he's like, no, but it might be better if I did. You know, that John does a very good job with that kind of devastation. Chemistry with all the other actors is great. I mean, you know, they all have such a rapport, you know. Mm-hmm. And, you know, John Ritter was just such a lovable guy, and that really, you really see that in this role of Ben Hanscom.
Yeah, and this might seem a little random, but I don't know if this is if this is on the newer editions of the DVD and Blu-ray, but I have the old DVD of it, and there's a really good commentary track from Tommy Lee Wallace and several of the actors, including John Ritter, so this was obviously recorded before he died.
Shortly before he died.
Oh, really? Yeah, so I highly recommend, if you get the DVD, check out that commentary. Now, Jeremy, I know you've met a couple of the actors from this movie.
Oh, yes. Well, I suppose I should start off with the greatest of them all, Mr. Tim Curry. I had the honor of meeting Mr. Curry at Monster Mania in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, a year ago at their March 2018 show. I went inside, and I was so humbled to be in his presence. And I said to him, you know, you terrified me as it. Well, actually, first he shook my hand, and I must say, he has a very strong grip. And while we were shaking hands, he asked me my name. I told him Jeremy. And I told him, you terrified me as it. And he goes, how old were you? And I told him 10. And he responded, oh, I'm sorry about that. I've also met Richard Thomas, you know, who played the adult Bill Denborough, and he is another very nice guy. I asked him several questions about it, and here's what he said. Let's see. I asked him if it was scary to see Tim Curry in full getup as Pennywise, and he said that Tim Curry is scary even without makeup. I also asked him what working with John Ritter was like, and he said that he and John had been friends for a while, so it was good. And when I asked him what he thought about the It remake, he said that it hadn't been made yet, so he doesn't know, but once it comes out, he's sure it will be intense. This is obviously old information, so... But yeah, Richard Thomas, I've met him a few times, and yeah, he's always very nice. And I've gotten some stuff signed by him, and by Curry as well. Tim Curry, I got a big photo of Pennywise signed, and also this photo for this upcoming documentary, Pennywise, the Story of It, which I actually donated money to, and unfortunately it's taking a lot longer than expected, which I'm not thrilled about, especially since I'm still waiting for that signed poster they owe me, but I'm sure it'll be fantastic once it comes out. But I also met Annette O'Toole, adult Beverly, very briefly at an off-Broadway show she was doing. I also had the great pleasure of meeting Dennis Christopher, who he was so nice. He actually said to me as soon as he saw me, "You look like John Ritter's son." And that just made my day. He said that John was wonderful to work with, and he also said that it took 4 months to film it, and that his death scene took 3 days to shoot. He said that his death scene wasn't his favorite thing to do, but that as an actor, sometimes you just have to do things. He asked me if I was an actor, and I told him that I'm taking an acting 1 course, which he gave a happy nod to. He then told me that while doing that I should do something on the side in addition, and suggested writing. And as soon as he said that, my dad chimed in with, "Oh, he loves to write." He said that that was a good combination. I also asked him if it was scary to see Tim Curry in full getup as Pennywise, and he told me that he felt sorry for him because of all the makeup he had to endure. He also had his dog with him, which he named after his character in Django Unchained. And Dennis Christopher, he also told me that he and John Ritter recorded the commentary for the It DVD 2 weeks before John passed away. I got Richard Thomas, Dennis Christopher, Annette O'Toole, Richard Mazur, who I'll talk about in a sec, and Tommy Lee Wallace, who I'll also talk about in a sec, to sign this 8x10 photo of the It Blu-ray cover. Richard Mazur, another nice guy, although he was a little on the impatient side, but still nice. I asked him what working with John Ritter and Tim Curry was like, and he told me that they were/are both great men. I also asked him what he thought about the, at the time, upcoming It remake, and he said, "I don't know shit about it. Everyone's been asking me that, and I don't know shit about it." Also, someone we haven't spoken about yet, Michael Cole, who plays adult Henry Bowers. He was very nice to meet. The first thing he said was that he loved my shirt. I had a shirt on with Boris Karloff as the Frankenstein monster, and I told him that I got it direct from Sarah Karloff. He told me that Boris Karloff was an amazing actor and that he started out on stage. He then told me that they filmed the scene pictured in the photo I'm holding in a real insane asylum, and that Tim Curry came in that day and went through the whole process of putting on the Pennywise makeup and costume for the shot in which he sticks his leg out from behind Michael. Last but not least, director Tommy Lee Wallace, who was also very nice. I asked him what working with Tim Curry and John Ritter was like, and he told me that they were both great, and that John was the more gregarious of the two, while Tim mostly kept to himself. He told me that John was probably the biggest star they had, but that he had no attitude, and that he's sorry he's gone. Now, one scene in the miniseries which I feel it would be a crime not to mention is the scene where Beverly goes to her childhood home to try to visit her father, but, you know, just she finds this old woman instead named Mrs. Kirsch, and at first she seems like such a kind old woman, offers, you know, invites her inside, offers her some tea, and what I believe are crumpets, and the scene starts out so peacefully, but then in the blink of an eye it just turns, you know, dour and creepy. You know, you start by seeing her rotted teeth, as, you know, she's saying, oh, just drink it up, dear. Drink it while it's nice and hot. And, you know, she looks down and the tea has turned to blood, and she just drops it. And the way it kind of elegantly falls out of her hands and crashes onto the floor, I think was done very well. And, you know, I just love how it, even though it figures out that she's starting to see through its ruse, it still likes to kind of carry on the Mrs. Kirsch persona a little longer as she says, oh, don't worry your little head off, dear. I'll get it. And, you know, after Beverly says, it did say Marsh on the doorbell. And I like how as she's picking up the pieces, she just says, still in that sweet old lady voice, if you're smart, dear, you'll run. Because to stay would mean worse than your death. And then it starts to transfer to Tim Curry's Pennywise voice, you know, they float. And then, oh, the piece de resistance. He turns into a dead, rotted version of Beverly's father. And just says her father's favorite catchphrase, I worry about you, baby. I worry a lot.
What do you think of that scene?
Well, that scene's pretty crazy. I mean, you know, I'm kind of torn between whether or not Kirsch has done well enough. Because I like that she's just casually like a nice old lady, but I think, I don't know, in the book you kind of get a sense that something isn't right as soon as Bev kind of steps in.
Alright.
So, I don't know, it depends on how you feel about, you know, how true it is to the book. Then again, you know, they're going to change up whatever they want for an adaptation.
Well, in the book, the house starts to become, you know, candy, like Hansel and Gretel. Mm-hmm. They didn't take that from the book, but I'm willing to forgive that.
Real quick, what do you guys think of the spider scene? Because I know a lot of people have really crapped on that. I mean, I understand why, but it's like, you gotta understand still it's a TV budget.
Yeah, I mean, it's the best effects they could get for the time. I don't know how much you can hate on it, really. Yeah. I mean, it's maybe they feel it caused you to not take it seriously anymore, but it's up for debate.
Mm-hmm. It's not, the effects aren't very good. I mean, I'm sure they worked very hard on them, but it looks silly. And also, something John Ritter said in the commentary, I totally agree with. They really should have had Tim record some dialogue to play over the footage of the spider. That would have been so much better, because Pennywise was the real villain of that film.
Real quick, I just want to address the elephant not in the room. Chris actually had to leave, so he won't be in the rest of the video. I do want to mention that there was actually an Indian adaptation of it. I think it was called Woe or something.
Yes.
It was actually a TV series. I've never seen it. I don't know if it's any good or not, but honestly, I'm really curious to check it out. I mean, I don't know, maybe it will be really bad, I don't know, but still, you can't deny it would be interesting to check it out, though.
It'd be an interesting watch, although I'd probably only watch it once.
Yeah. Apparently in that version, he's actually the ghost of a dead clown, as opposed to an interdimensional being taking on the form of a clown, from what I've heard. And before we talk about It 2017, I do want to mention a show that I think was definitely inspired by It, and that's Stranger Things. I actually think, especially the first season, is almost a very loose adaptation of It, and I think the Duffer Brothers even admitted that It was one of the main sources of inspiration. I mean, that show takes inspiration from a lot of stuff from 80s culture, like, of course it takes inspiration from It, but it also takes inspiration from other Stephen King novels like Carrie and Firestarter, but it also takes inspiration from the films of John Carpenter and the films of Steven Spielberg, especially E.T., and it's a really good show, too. Again, I think you could definitely see the It influence in the first season, but what do you think of?
I like it. I'm not one of those crazy, over-the-top fans of it. I think it's very good. I like the characters, but it was just never something I was really crazy about. I watched it, I liked it, and then I just moved on.
Now, in 2017, there was another adaptation of It that was specifically based on the childhood portions of the novel. I kind of have mixed opinions on the 2017 version. I do think it's a good movie. I actually think, in a lot of ways, it's a great movie, but I do have some issues with it. Like, it's funny, I kind of go back and forth between this and the 1990 version, where there are some things I think this did better than the 1990 version, and then there are some things that I think the 1990 version did better. But what do you think of It 2017?
I really like it. I think it's a good movie. Does it do the novel justice? Somewhat in some areas, in others not so much.
Yeah. Well, I don't think any of the adaptations really did the book justice, in my opinion. The one thing that the movie definitely got right was the whole coming-of-age aspect.
Yeah, sure.
Honestly, it's a really good coming-of-age movie, I will say that.
Yeah.
I thought some of the characters, though, were kind of, the movie kind of sacrificed a lot of character development, with the exception of Beverly. I would say Beverly was probably the most well-rounded character in the movie.
Yeah, I could agree with that. She definitely had a great arc, and you felt sympathy for her, and Sophia Lillis did a great job.
Oh, yeah.
She was very, likable, very sympathetic, but also vulnerable, and, which I guess made her more relatable. Still, though, very feisty as well. And I actually had the pleasure of meeting Sophia Lillis at Monster Mania in 2018. She was very nice. And I asked her if it was scary to see Bill Skarsgård in full getup as Pennywise, and she told me, well, he's a really nice guy, so it was kind of confusing. So yeah, I got a photo with her, got a picture signed by her, a very nice girl. Jaden Lieberherr, well, now Jaden Martell, as Bill. I almost met him at Monster Mania, but the thing was I was waiting on Tim Curry's line for so long that when I finally got off it, they had capped his line. I was furious. But yeah, he does a great job in the movie. I think he, like Jonathan Brandis and Richard Thomas before him, he gets the stuttering down pat.
Yeah, he was very good. Honestly, I think there's a place in heaven for whoever the casting director of this movie was, because I think all the child actors in this nailed their freaking roles. And I would say Bill, probably next to Beverly, was one character that also got the most character development in this. Whereas, again, I felt some of the other characters were kind of just shortchanged, especially Mike. Felt like Mike was almost a non-entity in this movie.
Well, I mean, he had some scenes of his own. The scene on his grandfather's farm, the scene where he sees Pennywise in that nightmarish vision at the meat factory. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say they totally shortchanged him.
What I mean by that is just, he was such an integral part of the story, and, and in the book you had the whole racial subtext, which I understand why they changed that, because this is set in the 80s instead of the 50s, but I know you had issues with that.
Yes, I did. I think one of the movie's biggest mistakes was from changing the timeline from 1958 to 1989, A lot of people have this sort of vision of the 1950s as this idyllic, innocent time full of, innocence and milkshakes, and, everyone was friendly to each other, and, nothing could go wrong, and, but really that wasn't the case. There was a lot of racism and homophobia and all that other horrible stuff. And I think It is the perfect metaphor for all that ugliness lurking behind the facade of small-town values.
Facade, you mean? I think it's pronounced facade. At least that's how I always pronounced it.
Alright, but anyway, and I just don't get that vibe with the 1980s. So yeah, that was a big mistake on their part.
Yeah. Again, I kind of understand why they did it, but I feel like one of the great things about the book was all the subtext, and the movie kind of lost a lot of that subtext, I think. Yeah, but I think the biggest sin is just it kind of sacrificed some character development, I think. And I understand because it's only a movie, like it's only like a 2-hour-long movie where the only way to really do the book justice is you would have to do a 9-part miniseries, honestly. That's the only way I could think to really do justice to how much is in the book. So I understand, like, you know, why they cut so much out and why they sacrifice so much characterization, because it's not that long of a movie, but that's also kind of the issue with it, is the fact that it is not a story that really should have been, you know, just a movie, you know? What do you think of Finn Wolfhard as Richie?
Oh, he does a great job. He's very funny and delightfully obnoxious.
It shows his range as an actor because he's so different than the character he plays on Stranger Things in this, so it just shows how good of an actor he is. The one thing, though, if you remember the scene at the house at Niebald Street where Richie's locked in that room with all those clown dolls, and then Pennywise pops up and he says, "Beep, beep, Richie." That was a great shout-out for fans of the book, but in context of the movie, that really makes no sense because none of the other characters have said "Beep, beep, Richie" to him.
True, although that still was a great scene when he pops out of the coffin.
Yeah, and remember, one of the clown dolls actually was made to look like Tim Curry's Pennywise.
That was a nice homage. So yeah, Finn Wolfhard's great. I also like Jack Dylan Grazer as Eddie. He was perfectly hypochondriac-like.
Yeah,
and,
that kid did a really good job.
Yeah. And I got to meet him at Monster Mania. He was very nice. Got him to sign a photo, got him to take a photo with me, and when I went to look at the photo, I was delighted to find out that I had been photobombed by Georgie.
Yeah, I mean, even Mike, like, even though, again, I felt like they really kind of shortchanged Mike in this movie, the actor playing him did a very good job with what he was given. I just think they should have gave Mike a lot more to do. I like that little touch of, like, the children's program, and all of a sudden Pennywise appears on the children's program. Yeah. And the way the children's program starts talking to Henry Bowers and all that.
That was pretty good.
Although I do want to mention, the actor who played Henry Bowers in this did really good.
Yeah, that actor's name is Nicholas Hamilton, and I agree, he did a great job. And I've seen him also in this 2015 or 2014 indie film called Captain Fantastic, where he plays one of Viggo Mortensen's sons. And he's just great in that, too. It's a good movie. You should check it out.
All right.
But yeah, he's a great actor, and he really shows off the psychosis of Henry Bowers. I mean, he really means business.
Yeah.
This is a kid you do not want to cross.
Now, another issue I do have with the movie is there is a lot of comedy, and I feel like some of the comedy undercuts the drama in it. Like, there are some genuinely emotionally moving moments that kind of get undercut by some of Richie's stupid-ass jokes.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
But the one thing we touched on it a little bit, but we really have to talk about it, Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise.
Yes. It would be a crime not to mention him. I think he does a great job. You know, he really makes Pennywise his own, and that's just great. It would have been so easy for him to have just copied Tim Curry, and I'm so glad that he didn't do that.
At the same time, for me personally, I think Tim Curry was the better Pennywise, only because this is just me, and I think Bill Skarsgård's a great actor, and he does do a good job, but this version of Pennywise, there's no real subtlety to it. I feel like Tim Curry's Pennywise, there's such a subtlety and a nuance to that character.
I can see that, but, I mean, I think there are times where Bill Skarsgård's Pennywise does try to be a little more subtle, like when in the scene with Georgie, you know, he does kind of get a little playful and gleeful and silly, you know, like a clown would. You know, when he introduces himself, he goes, "I'm Pennywise the dancing clown."
And I like that little sound effect where you hear, like, bells jingling.
Yeah, that was great. and I just love how, you know, they're kind of talking and bantering, and, you know, he's playing around, but then as they're laughing and Georgie's laughing, suddenly, and this goes just like Tim Curry's Pennywise did, his face just goes blank and he just stares at him, and the music gets all really low and eerie, and it's like he's forgetting that he's supposed to be putting on an act, and he, you know, because he's staring at his food and he's hungry, so he's forgetting that he's supposed to be putting on an act, and, you know, he gets lost in the moment, and then he snaps out of it and just goes, "But without your boat, you can't lose it, Georgie. Bill is going to kill you." And the interesting thing about him saying that is he's played by Bill Skarsgård, so Bill literally does kill him.
Yeah.
And I do love how, unlike the miniseries, they do show him biting the arm off, and I really just enjoyed seeing the jaws open up. That was the part I liked, you know, where you see him in the sewer, he grabs the arm, and, you know, and that sound effect, that was just great.
We do have to mention, this movie brings in the character of Patrick Hockstetter from the book, and completely wastes him.
Oh my god, yes they do. In the book, he has a terrifying but deserved death scene with the flying leeches sucking him dry. And in the movie, they completely change that. They don't even mention that he's a sadistic animal killer. He's just another carbon copy bully, basically.
Yeah, they might as well not even have called him Patrick Hockstetter, I think.
But back to Bill Skarsgård. I mean, I think he does a great job. His Pennywise is definitely more primal and animalistic than Tim Curry's was. But I think for this version, that works. You know, it's like, I mean, as you told me, as you put it, you know, Bill's Pennywise is this entity that is desperately trying to act human. And I think Bill pulls that off very well.
Yeah. Want to tell the story on how you met Bill Skarsgård?
Oh, sure. Back in September, shortly after I saw It Chapter 2, I went to the stage door for The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, and was lucky enough to get him to sign, where Bill Skarsgård was a guest, and was lucky enough to get him to sign both a photo of him as Pennywise and also my copy of Stephen King's It. Now, let me tell you, though, getting these two autographs was not easy. He went inside to do the show, and now at The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, they make all us graphers, all us autograph seekers, wait across the street. So if the celebrity wants to sign, they have to walk over across the street. So Bill, his car parks near the stage door, and he goes in, but well, he gets out of the car and he sort of waves to us and says, "I'll sign after," you know, after he films his appearance. So about an hour or so later, he comes out, and he's nice enough to come across the street to sign for us graphers, of which there were a lot, and I swear to God, as soon as he came over, all hell broke loose. People were pushing, people were shoving, people were screaming. Oh my God, it was madness. I had to basically hold both my photo and my book out like this among all the hundreds of other people holding stuff out for him to sign and, you know, trying desperately to get his attention. And I can vaguely remember one of the guards saying something like, "If you keep acting like this, we're gonna take him away."
From what you're telling me about how the people were acting around him, I almost understand why there are some celebrities that are real dicks, because it's like, let's face it, there are some fans out there that are fucking psychotic.
Oh, believe me, I'd say a good percentage, maybe 90%, maybe even more, of graphers are complete and total lowlifes.
Well, you realize you're talking about your own people, you know? I mean, you're a grapher too.
Oh, believe me, I don't consider these scumbags my people. I mean, I've met some very nice people doing this. Unfortunately, the bad far outnumber the good. I mean, I've been collecting autographs since 2008, but I only started to go, like, to New York City to get autographs at barricades since 2014. And in that time, I have been pushed, I have been shoved, I have been verbally harassed, I have been screamed at, I have been threatened. I have been made to the point where I feel completely unsafe. And on 2 separate occasions, I had autographs almost get stolen from me by a couple of low-life pieces of shit who were completely lacking in any kind of moral value whatsoever.
Don't hold back. Say how you really feel. And the 2017 film had a sequel in 2019 called It Chapter 2, which was specifically based on the adult portions of the novel. Jeremy, I'm gonna let you talk first, because I know you have a lot of opinions about this one.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, I was very underwhelmed by It Chapter 2. I thought it was a big disappointment, and I thought that while it had some good scenes, it was much too long, didn't use enough from the book, had humor in really inappropriate places.
Yeah, I'm like the definition of mixed when it comes to this movie. There's a lot I do like about this movie, and overall I will say I liked this movie a lot, but I had a lot of problems with it too. My biggest issue, probably my number one issue with this, is I don't understand why they felt the need to make it a full-fledged comedy. Because you can't tell me this movie is not a comedy. I mean, like, when Eddie's strangling the leper, and then the leper pukes on him, and it starts playing Don't Call Me Angel. Is that the song? I mean, I'm not...
No,
that...
it's Just Call Me Angel.
Oh, Just Call Me Angel? I mean, it's like, what?
Yeah, that was bad.
Like, I don't know if that
really
was
bad.
Actually Andy Muschietti's decision, or was that studio interference? Like... Was some studio executive like, no, you gotta make this more humorous for the kids or something?
I'm almost hoping that it was a case of studio interference, because if that was Andy Muschietti's decision, I just want to say, what the hell were you thinking?
I mean, granted, some of the humor in the movie I thought was funny. Like, I thought the guy who played the adult Eddie... I will say this, though, he was funny in the movie. He was very funny, but... Did the movie really need that much humor? I mean, this is a story that deals with child murder.
Yeah, James Ryan's son was good. Bill Hader was also very good.
I will say Bill Hader, he was funny, but they actually gave Richie a lot of pathos in this, where you find out that he's gay. I thought that was actually not a bad revelation for the character, because, granted, I never got that implication from the book at all, but it makes sense because... They do bring in, like, Adrian Mellon and his boyfriend getting jumped, which is in the book. And I do have to say, they handled that scene wonderfully in the movie. But the movie does have, definitely tries to have some of the social subtext that the book had, like themes of homophobia. So making Richie gay kind of ties into that, I think.
No, I mean, I didn't mind the revelation that he was gay, although I did wish they had used the thing from the novel where it's revealed that while it was alive, they couldn't have children.
Yeah.
There was a lot of stuff from the novel I wish they'd used, and a lot of flashback scenes to the younger losers, and I must say, the de-aging effects on the kids just looks terrible. It was completely distracting.
You see, I didn't notice that at all.
I did.
My biggest issue is, in the book, you get this real sense that they feel they have a responsibility to destroy it. In this movie, when they finally figure out why Mike called them back and they start to remember what happened to them, they're all pissed at Mike for, why would you do this? And they all try to, like, leave the town. It's like, the movie makes the Losers Club not very heroic, I think.
Yeah, I can agree with that. And speaking of not being heroic, yeah, Mike is a total dick in this movie. I mean, he is an absolute prick.
Yeah, that's my issue with both these movies. Okay, in the first one, Mike is kind of a non-character, and in this one, he's a dick. You know, so both movies did not do Mike well at all. I mean, we didn't talk enough about Tim Reed as Mike in the 1990 miniseries.
He was great.
The whole thing where you find out that he stole that Native American artifact from those, like, Native Americans who lived by dairy, that's something that the Mike of the book and the Mike of the 1990 version never would have done.
Yeah. He also would have never drugged his friend's drink. That is just not something a friend would do.
And I also thought the way they handled its origin in the movie was so freaking clunky. The positives I will say about the movie, there are some genuinely emotionally moving moments when it flashes back to their childhood. Like, a lot of the stuff of them flashing back to Stan, I thought was handled extremely well, I think.
It's interesting because, you know, they also tried to give Stan a little more to do other than, you know, receive the call and commit suicide. Personally, I really don't think it worked all that well because, you know, when they show him at the end, you know, before he killed himself, you know, writing the letter to all the losers, I'm just, you know, he gives the reason for his suicide being that, you know, oh, I was going to hold you back, I wanted to give you a fighting chance, and I'm just like, you could have given them a better fighting chance by actually showing up and pulling your weight.
Yeah, the way it was worded is like, if you really think about what was said in the letter, it's like, that makes no sense whatsoever, but I get why they did it, because I will say that scene at the end where Bill's reading the letter from Stan and then he starts crying, like, that is a very powerful moment of drama. But the issue is, my biggest issue with this movie is that, yeah, they shortchanged a lot of the drama for comedy.
I do enjoy the final battle where, you know, he is in the giant spider form, but you still see Pennywise on the top of it. I think that's an improvement over the mini-series of Spider.
I still think it would have been cool if, like, it would have been, like, a pure giant spider, but Bill Skarsgård's voice is coming from the spider. I thought that would have been really cool.
Another scene I like in the movie is the scene where he confronts Richie when Richie is alone on the Paul Bunyan statue. And, you know, it's a beautiful image of him first on the statue. And, you know, he's kind of taunting him by saying, play a game with me, would ya? You know, how about Street Fighter? Or maybe Truth or Dare? And then, you know, he holds onto the balloons and, you know, he's floating down. And it's just a beautiful image to see of him floating down. And,
yeah,
you know, he's saying, I know your secret, your dirty little secret.
We should touch on, like, some of the other actors in this. Like, I thought James McAvoy did a very good job as Bill. Why am I blanking on her?
Jessica Chastain.
Yeah, Jessica Chastain. Amazing as the adult Beverly.
Yeah.
I mean, all the actors, I would say, did very good jobs. You know, again, the movie did sacrifice some character development that was in the book.
But yeah, Jessica Chastain's very good. And you remember I met her at the Late Show with Stephen Colbert. It was actually like a week before she went to start filming it, Chapter 2. She was just so lovely. She signed and took photos and really just took her time with everyone. And
can't wait to see you in it.
Yeah. Have you read the book?
Oh, cool.
The script is so good, you guys.
I also met James McAvoy and Bill Hader, but that was years before they did it, Chapter 2. Another big thing I was disappointed about was, you know, with the trailers and certain IMDb trivia I read, they teased that they were going to go into the origin of Pennywise.
Yeah, specifically not it, but like its Pennywise form.
And, you know, I was so excited to see that, and I was so pumped to see that, because that would be interesting to find out. And I think they hinted at it in the 2017 film, you know, where Bev wakes up in its lair and she sees that stage that says Pennywise the Dancing Clown. That hinted at that. And in It Chapter 2, we see him briefly in human form, putting on the makeup, and then that's it.
And also the Mrs. Kirsch scene in that was done, it was just so over the top, I think. Yeah. Whereas in the 1990 version and the book, it's so creepy. In that, like, I don't know, when Kirsch, like, turns into that big monster, it's like, again, there's so much stuff in this movie that was just so unnecessary. It's like, it's a story that could have benefited from being a lot more subtle, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the Mrs. Kirsch scene in this isn't terrible. It has some good things going for it, you know? I like how they're kind of just sitting across from each other and that old-timey music is playing, and also, I like how Beverly is looking at these very old photographs while Mrs. Kirsch is telling her about how her father, you know, was from the old country and came with $14 in his pocket. I also do like how she tells her that, you know, no one who dies in Derry ever really dies.
That was kind of creepy, and I will say, Like that part where she just smiles at him and at her. It lingers on her smile. That was actually a very David Lynch-esque thing. I've seen stuff like that in films like Eraserhead, so it's like, okay, like, yeah, there were some good things about the Mrs. Kirsch scene. We should mention Stephen King's cameo.
Oh, yes.
What did you think of that?
I thought it was fitting for him. I enjoyed it. The shop owner who sells Bill his old bike.
Yeah. So yeah, that was our review on both the book, It, by Stephen King, and our long-ass discussions on the movies. I mean, granted, the whole video is pretty long-ass, I'm sure. I hope you enjoyed this review. I hope you stuck through all of it till the end. And long days and pleasant nights to you.